You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk, your local community radio run by volunteers. Log on to our website at dialectradio.co.uk to find out more.
Scott Bennett, I was a former U.S. Army officer in the Psychological Warfare Division at U.S. Special Operations Command, U.S. Central Command. I was a counterterrorism analyst and liaison officer for the State Department. And before that, I was with the Bush administration. And I was also a defense contractor with Booz Allen Hamilton, and specifically did psychological warfare and terrorism finance. So I tracked the terrorist financial supplies, banks, routes, donors, and all of the financial instruments that have been used in funding Saudi terrorism, Qatari terrorism in Libya and ISIS, the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, basically all over U.S. Central Command's area of operations.
Now, to put it politely, you were eased out of your job. Would you like to just share with us what you found out about the way terrorism is financed while you were there?
Well, I ran into Booz Allen Hamilton. My boss was Dov Zakheim. Dov Zakheim was the comptroller at the Pentagon when $2.3 trillion went missing. And the next day was the attack on the Pentagon in 9/11. So Dov Zakheim was my boss who was in charge of that. And after his Pentagon stint, he went down to U.S. Central Command in Florida. And that's where I was introduced to him. And I started finding out all sorts of contractor fraud and failures in the intelligence community, failures to share intelligence, failures to pursue a lot of the banks and international partners that were behind the Saudi, Qatari, Kuwait, Middle Eastern funding of terrorism. And I didn't exactly know why, but I found out when I started making reports and giving briefings and asking questions. And I was fired from Booz Allen Hamilton, charged with a paperwork error on a housing form that they had me fill out, and thrown into jail by the Obama Justice Department for about 2 years, and appealed and had military attorneys and made as much noise as I could. But it was a cover-up designed to silence me. And what was ironic was when I was put in jail, I met Brad Birkenfeld, the Swiss banker who had also been imprisoned by Eric Holder and Lanny Brewer and Hillary Clinton and Obama in 2009. So he had been there for a year, and I had just met him, and it was sort of a divine event, because here is the man that I should have been introduced to in the military with all of the Swiss bank accounts that were being used by people like Abdullah Aziz, the Saudi royal family, various people in the Israeli, Qatar, Saudi circles. And I had to go to jail to meet him. And he showed me all of his WikiLeaks cables and his banking statements and his entire repertoire. And I took that and I said, no one in the military has ever contacted you about this stuff? And he said, I've been forbidden to share it with anybody in the military. So I said, well, I'm an officer still in the military, and I've been thrown in here, but that doesn't stop me from filing reports. So I took it as an officer and filed it up to the military, Pentagon Inspector General, and the House and the Senate Intelligence and Armed Services Committee, and everyone you can imagine in Washington, D.C., and the military brass, and as well as the media, people in Fox News and CNN and NBC, ABC. I was introduced by the Washington Post and Michael Isikoff, Tom Hamburger, and no one did anything. No one lifted a finger. No one investigated. No one asked me for anything. So that's probably the greatest scandal and betrayal of America that's ever happened.
What should these people have done, both congressmen, senators, military officers, and the media?
Well, they should have immediately had a closed-door debriefing where Brad Birkenfeld's bank accounts and financial instruments were brought forth and examined for connection to men on the ground that were in Syria, that were in Libya, that were in Iraq, and track those financial instruments back to their sources, which led to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait. And they never did that. And they never examined or questioned me, a military officer who did this for a living and had a top secret SCI clearance. So I had the top secret clearance that no one else had, and I did this for a living. So you would think they would question the officer who provides this, and they never did.
Doesn't that suggest that this is rather than a mistake, that this is a deliberate cover-up, that these bank accounts are being used with the knowledge of some people at the top in the Western military to finance terrorism?
Well, that's the only conclusion you can make, is that it was a cover-up, that these bank accounts were being used for nefarious reasons, including terrorism. And they didn't want whistleblowers making noise. That's why Eric Holder and Lanny Brewer, who were the Attorney General and the Assistant Attorney General, worked for the law firm Covington & Burling that represented these Swiss banks. And Covington & Burling also networked and represented people in the Clinton Foundation. And Dov Zakheim, my boss, his son, was given a job at Covington & Burling. So this law firm, Covington & Burling, and its connections to the Clinton Foundation and Eric Holder and Lanny Brewer, all recently came out this past 6 months in the WikiLeaks revelations. So the combination of the WikiLeaks, the combination of Oliver Stone's film Snowden, which depicts Brad Birkenfeld as a Pakistani banker, incidentally, but it depicts Brad Birkenfeld being targeted by CIA operatives and thrown in a jail, and the CIA tried to use him as an asset. Brad told me the exact story back in 2012. So the combination of all of these material information sources coming from good trusted sources, WikiLeaks, Snowden, and myself and Brad Birkenfeld, leads to an absolutely incontrovertible series of connections and proof that the military, the intelligence community, and the Congress had an obligation to review, and they never did. The hope is that Donald Trump, the new presidency, is going to be different, that he is going to investigate where others refuse to. And if he doesn't, then he's just as guilty.
Now, you were working at something called CENTCOM in Florida. This is something very few people have heard of. Because it takes responsibility for U.S. military involvement and other sorts of involvement in the Middle East. What sort of things go on at CENTCOM, and what's its role in the world today?
Well, U.S. Central Command is the U.S. military area of operation for all of the Middle East countries, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Libya. It's recently branched off into AFRICOM, but all of the Middle East countries, Sudan, Yemen, they are under U.S. Central Command's jurisdiction because of the wars that we've led over there. And it's a base that has an operation in Tampa, Florida, at MacDill Air Force Base, and also, of course, in the Middle East. And at MacDill, you have an international presence of Australians, United Kingdom, New Zealand, Canadian, Australian personnel that all work and combine their intelligence efforts for prosecuting the various wars in the Middle East. So Central Command is, and also U.S. Special Operations Command, which I also work for, are down in Florida, and they really are the tip of the spear for all of the military operations we have in the Middle East. And that's where all of this material should have been examined and should have been investigated, should have been prosecuted. I should have had Brad Birkenfeld in the skiff interrogating him, but instead the only place I interrogated him was in jail, but it still gave me all of the information that the American people don't know anything about, but that we've recently published and are aggressively pushing forth. And anybody can read it by going to lulu.com and Googling Shell Game by Scott Bennett. The report was Shell Game, a military whistleblowing report to Congress, and all of the documents, all of the supplemental forms and evidence and WikiLeaks materials and letters from various congressmen and senators that were trying to bury this, trying to cover it up, are all contained there. And we expect it to be coming forth and being released more and more.
Now, Central Command, some people would say it should be shut down. What business have the United States got militarily intervening in all these countries right across the Middle East and the northeast of Africa?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Because is it in the American people's best interest? Is it in the European people's best interest? Is it within the confines and the parameters and the laws of our constitutions which govern the exercise of our military? I would say no, in every respect. And in fact, the United States and Britain and or France, we've all been on the wrong side of terrorism because we've sold our souls for a barrel of oil, and the pegging of the U.S. petrodollar or the U.S. dollar to oil is really the reason and the basis for our alliance with Saudi Arabia. And yet Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabi ideology, which it fanatically pushes, is the very ideology which ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of these extremists have been following blindly and beheading and doing the most heinous acts that the human imagination is capable of. That is entirely Wahhabi. And, Americans really are sorely ignorant of the differences between the Saudi Arabian Wahhabi, Salafist, Takfiri types, which basically believe you're either a Muslim or you are a slave or you're killed. You either convert or you die. And that's the Wahhabi Saudi Arabian view. The Shia, the Iranian, the Syrian are not like that. But we are very ignorant of those differentials. And I think a large part is because Israel has dominated the information flow and tried to push America against Iran in order to facilitate the Greater Israel Project devoted and on, where the geographical footprint is expanded and Israel has a large geographical presence.
Now, Trump's defense secretary, I think he is Mad Dog, they call him, James Mattis. He was the chief of CENTCOM. What do you make of him?
Well, James Mattis has a lot of explaining to do on one level because we supplied him with the report, Brad Birkenfeld and myself, on terrorist financing from Union Bank of Switzerland, from Saudi Arabia and all these various bank account holders that Brad Birkenfeld was the personal banker of. We supplied General Mattis and U.S. Central Command and U.S. Psychological Operations Command and the Pentagon Inspector General. We supplied them with this report, and they refused to do a single thing. I had an officer at Fort Bragg hang up on me when I questioned him about what was being done. So they've acknowledged it. They know that it exists. And I've seen senators writing letters. For example, Senator Bill Nelson of Florida wrote Senator Dianne Feinstein about me and my report, making all sorts of accusations and threats, but yet never once questioning or raising the issue of the substance of the report. Never once talking about the illegal terrorist financing Swiss banks that were cited in the report. Instead, he was criticizing me for whistleblowing as a Booz Allen Hamilton contractor. So the American senators and congressmen, including John McCain, including Lindsey Graham, including Dianne Feinstein, and a whole host of others, Mike Rogers, Peter King, including Jeff Sessions, they've all been informed, and they all have blood on their hands. And they really have an account to give and answer a question in the dock, and some of them should be convicted of treason and executed. James Mattis was informed. What he did about it was absolutely nothing. Michael Flynn was also informed. And 30 days after being informed is when the memo came out from the Defense Intelligence Agency citing the Sunni Salafist Saudi Arabian desire to establish an ISIS state and financing them. Well, where did he get that idea? Well, one source came from us, but yet they've never done anything. They've never examined Brad Birkenfeld or myself. They've never put us together and looked at these accounts and the WikiLeaks cables and the specific bank holders. So the pattern is hide, cover up, and attack and slander the spokesperson, attack the character of the whistleblower.
What about Michael Flynn? He's been forced to resign this week, just after a couple of weeks in post as the National Security Advisor. What do you make of that motives behind that? Is that good, bad thing, or because it's quite clearly to do with the relations with Russia? Well,
that was probably the best quality that Michael Flynn had, was that he wasn't looking to make war with Russia. He was actually smart enough to realize that Russia is a natural ally of the United States and has more culturally in tune with the American people as the Orthodox Christians that they are than most others. So General Flynn's attitude towards Russia was a very healthy breath of fresh air. The only negative aspect, I would say, is his vehement, violent hostility towards Iran and the misguided understanding of them as a state sponsor of terrorism and as the source of radical Islamic extremism. That's just ignorant, because the Iranians are not that temperamentally inclined, and certainly not politically inclined, because they've never waged war on anybody since 1775. So to say that Iran is an enemy is really an agenda that is not the American people's agenda. It's not in the best interest of Americans. But of course, he's subject to a lot of the Israeli-American Political Action Conference, and the Israelis' lobby, as we know, is very active. But he was, if he was fired, I've said this on Press TV, there's a couple possibilities, and we don't know the whole truth. If he was legitimately fired by Trump for indiscretions, then that's one thing. But it appears that Trump wanted to keep him. And if he abandoned his post, if he quit Trump, then I think he's a coward and a weakling and stupid, because he had a duty to serve his president. He had a duty to stand his ground and weather the storm and not back away from anyone. The other possibility is that, Trump recognized things in him that were deficient, and he made that call. There's also
hang on, because Trump has it's always, we can get lots of information from Trump because he uses Twitter. And one of the things he said is that he believes that there were illegal leaks from the FBI that have caused the downfall of Michael Flynn. So clearly Trump is not happy.
Well, that would make sense as well, because we have a lot of Obama people that were in the State Department, in the NSA, in the Pentagon, that would be using every opportunity they could to undermine anything Trump was doing. So Ben Rhodes or people in Homeland Security or NSA, they were the ones most likely tapping into any phone calls or doing any leaks. Of course, the FBI and the CIA have to have Russia as an enemy. They have to have Iran as an enemy to justify their budgets and their personnel. So if Trump was really upset about him going, which he shouldn't have done, I think, again, Flynn should never have left, then Trump really needs to unleash the full force of his Department of Justice to investigate who did this leaking of Flynn's material and prosecute them, because you do have an oath to secrecy when you are employed by the United States government. But I think that's all going to come out. But Trump really needs to get aggressive and attack, because it's clear he's being attacked from all sides just for political reasons. This has got nothing to do with reality or policy. This is all Democrat, neoconservative war hawks against Trump because he wants to make friends with Russia and he doesn't want to go to war. I think his statement to Netanyahu saying do not build any more settlements for right now, I think he said back off or put it on hold. I think that's a positive action. He's got to be ginger, of course. He's so new in the job that he's getting attacked from all sides. So he can't necessarily say what he means. He has to sort of, pull the rope that's been the U.S. policy for the past 25 years.
Okay, now you're an expert in terrorism, I think it's fair to say, and we keep hearing this ever since 9/11: terrorist, all the time. Now, a terrorist is supposed to be a non-state actor, and yet what you have uncovered, particularly to do with financing, suggests that actually at arm's length, a lot of the terrorists are being financed covertly by intelligence services. I wonder if you think that's fair, and how does that change the way we should see terrorists and terrorist acts?
Well, when we start at the beginning of 9/11 and we look at the September 11th attacks in New York and the Pentagon, any reasonable person walks away knowing that those were artificial false flag attacks, that it's impossible for buildings to fall at free fall speed, that planes could never have melted metal, and that the Pentagon was hit by a missile, not by a plane, because of the absence of the plane parts. I know that for a fact because I drove by the Pentagon the next day when I was doing my doctoral studies at Catholic University, and there was no plane parts anywhere. It was just one big blue tarp covering a hole. So the artificiality of the September 11th attacks we know from a scientific point of view. And we also know from a political point of view that that attack was used to justify the war on terror, to expand the U.S. hegemony into the 7 countries in 5 years, as General Wesley Clark had said. So they justified this endless war in the Middle East, which some would say, like Scott Ricard, that was part of the Israeli Oded Anon plan to expand its geographical footprint. They did that from 2001 until I mean, really, to present, it's been ongoing. And they've expanded into Libya and Syria, and they tried to do it in Egypt. The Arab Spring was just one big psychological warfare product engineered by the CIA. I was there at the RAND Corporation when they were planning it, so I can say it with absolute authority. I can also say I've interviewed people like James and Joanne Moriarty, who were in Libya as Americans and provided people like Michael Flynn and the CIA with all of the intelligence they needed, that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were state funders with Hillary Clinton of all of these mercenaries to come into Libya, overthrow Gaddafi, steal the gold, steal the natural resources, base an Israeli base up in the mountains. And since then, we've had the fall of Libya, and millions upon millions of Africans and Muslim Islamic people fled up into Europe. So the European invasion by the Muslim population is really the fruit of the American policy and the British policy under Cameron, as well as Tony Blair, and the French policy under Sarkozy. But there are some striking examples of treason and cover-up that should be examined, such as the fact that American politicians and I think European politicians were paid $10 million to appear and give positive comments and take photographs with the rebels. And that $10 million came from the $500 billion that was stolen from the Libyan economy. Libya was described as a bank, as a country, but it was really just one single autonomous bank. It was not connected, to any of the globalist banks. And I don't think anybody better than you, Tony, is the expert in some of these, such as the Rothschild banks and the tentacles of some of these organizations through the Council of Foreign Relations and the Bilderbergs and others.
Well, also the Bank for International Settlements. I think we can't let that one pass by, because this is the central banker's central bank in Basel, in Switzerland, that was involved in the Second World War in financing Hitler, and also providing the Nazis with all the foreign exchange that they needed. And at the end of the Second World War, at the Bretton Woods Conference, a vote was passed to shut down the BIS. Now, we are in the UK, dubiously, I suppose, privileged to have the head of some of their regulation committees now running the Bank of England as Governor of the Bank of England. Mark Carney was in charge of, in the noughties, in the run-up to 2008, in running global banking regulation. So the man who was responsible for letting the banks off the hook, allowing all the false accounting, is now in charge of the Bank of England. So I suppose you can only say God help us with someone like that at the reins, because they kept saying that he was from Canada when he was introduced, and everyone talks about him as being from the Bank of Canada, but that was a really a tiny role that he had. Much more important was his role at this Nazi bank in Basel. But anyway, look, just to bring it round to to some kind of conclusion here, fake news is a phrase we keep hearing since the 17th of November 2016, when it was announced by Barack Obama and Angela Merkel in Berlin as a great plague that we all had to watch out for. 2 days after, by the way, Google releasing their fake news app 2 days before the announcement by Obama and Merkel. So one wonders if maybe they were doing the PR for Google when they were announcing it. And I wonder what you make of this phrase and how genuine you think it is. And is it possible to get hold of news that isn't fake news? And if so, where from?
Well, I think, the true news, the truth, is coming from people like yourself, Tony, alternative media types from trusted sources, men of integrity, researchers, academics, people who do their homework, who can coordinate and connect the dots and pull together all of the research that we've got from history, from politics, from the international map, from the international financial flows and systems and the stakeholders and all of that. It's a very complicated game. But for the intellectually astute and those with history, those who've actually worked in the intelligence, military, and political circles, it's a little bit easier. But it comes from sources other than the mainstream media. The mainstream media, of course, are CIA dominated. It is and I saw this when I worked in the various circles. CIA, the Mossad, and MI6 and Saudi intelligence have a stranglehold on the American communications, on the American channels, on TV, on the newspapers. So they're dominated by the ideology, and they're also crippled by a retardation in the moral characters of the people who work as journalists and editors. They really just follow a script. There's a laziness. There's no integrity. There's no national service. There is simply worker ants in some sort of nest mentality. And I think that's what sets the alternative media apart, is when we investigate and speak and present ourselves, it's out of a sense of loyalty, love for our fellow human beings, love for our country or what it used to be, and trying to resurrect and regain it from this international globalist, village attitude. So the CIA, Mossad, the British MI6, FBI, they all have their tentacles in the American information systems, and I would include the British as well. We do have hope, though, when we see more of the right, independent people like Marine Le Pen and to a certain degree in the United Kingdom and the Brexit vote and with Trump. I think those are indications of the people's impulse towards overturning the establishment, overturning the privileged class, and really getting people without a party to work in the political, influence areas. And I hope and pray that Donald Trump is such a person. I hope and pray he pulls back this misadventure of the American military in the Middle East, that he makes allies with Russia, and that he gets off of this crazy track of blaming Russia for Ukraine and Crimea. I've advised them that it was nothing to do with Russia. It was everything to do with Obama and Victoria Nuland and Hillary Clinton and the EU. That's where the Ukrainian coup came. And Russia simply absorbed Crimea, which was part of its original landmass for a long time, to protect its own geographic interests in the Black Sea. So I think Trump understands that, and his next level of education needs to be regarding Iran in comparison to the Saudi Arabians, and really shrinking this Wahhabi ideology back to Saudi Arabia and limiting that.
Let's hope that Trump makes it to high school. Anyway, what about where to get news which is not fake news? Is it possible? Because I think most people with half a brain can see we're being bombarded with all sorts of propaganda at the moment. So where do we go to find something that isn't fake news?
Well, some of the men that I work with and talk with on Project Camelot TV and Jim Fetzer and Veterans Today and Mike Harris and Catherine Shockdom, Press TV and RT, I think, are good sources to an extent. It's coming largely from the media, from the internet, and of course you've got to. Hang on, because the internet is the biggest source for fake news, surely. Well, that's what a lot of the mainstream media are trying to pitch. There are some trolls and PSYOPs that are meant to exacerbate the fake news brand and trying to make people think that there are propagandists out there. But I think when you have well-researched channels that put forth very sound information like SOTT, S-O-T-T network, and Sputnik, I think, is good. I think people can reach their own conclusions that those are factual examinations and are well-researched topics.
I mean, people will say that Sputnik is just Russian propaganda.
Well, I think people have to make their own judgment based on the facts and the research and comparisons. I mean, they've been trying to say Russia and Russia Today and Sputnik and others have been propaganda simply because they're telling the truth. I think the propagandists are saying that because they're trying to keep people asleep in a lie and keep them in fear.
Okay, I'm going to give you one key issue that people should watch out for fake news on, which you think is one that the propaganda is the hottest on, because what we tend to get is we get channels which are telling 90% of the truth, but on some issues they skew, they spin like crazy. I'd like to just give you finally one issue you think we should really watch out for the fake news on that issue.
Well, terrorist financing is I know best, and that is trying to sell Wahhabi Saudi Arabia as an ally in terrorism, and it's not. Saudi Arabia has been depicted as one of the partners of the Israeli Zionist U.S. war on terror and terrorist financing. I mean, we're fighting it and funding it at the same time. So Saudi Arabia getting a CIA medal, getting a medal from the CIA director, who incidentally received our report Shell Game and did nothing when he was in Congress. I think that's the greatest example of fake news, is that the Saudis are playing a role in fighting terror when, in actuality, the Iranians and the Russians are fighting terror starting in Syria. And I think Assad is smart to welcome U.S. assistance and really show that he's not the evil gas-wielding terrorist that they've been trying to make him look like.
Okay, and your Shell Game report, where can people find that online?
People can just Google Shell Game by Scott Bennett or go to the website. The publisher is lulu.com, Lulu.com, and it has a full report on all of the financial WikiLeaks cables and congressional reports that show very clearly the Saudi Arabian Swiss bank and most importantly, the political cover-up that occurred in the United States Congress of this whole thing, which I hope one day they will be very soon prosecuted for, because it's one of the greatest scandals in the history of this country.
Okay, so that's Shell Game by Scott Bennett on lulu.com. You can find that on your favourite search engine, not necessarily the NSA's front end, Google. Scott Bennett, thanks very much.
Thank you for fighting the good fight, Tony. You do a great job.
Thanks, Scott. That's all for this week. Dialects Bristol's first weekly MP3 podcast. If you're online, you can subscribe to our emails or download the podcast from dialectradio.co.uk. Thanks to our guests this week, Dr. Lisa Nolland, Chair of the Marriage, Sex and Culture Group of the Anglican Church, based here in Bristol, and also to Scott Bennett, former US Army Psychological Warfare Officer. Also to studio engineer Dave Bazanko. Dialects, a Bristol Broadband Co-op production. Catch us on Bristol Community FM 93.2 every Tuesday at noon, and anyone can contribute. Contact us through the People's Republic of Stokescroft, just off Jamaica Street, 0117 909 6897, or ersc.org.uk online. Also at Volunteering Bristol on 0117 989 7733. That's one word, volunteerbristol.org.uk. Also, there's the National Volunteering website, which is do-it.org. That was Dialect, and I'm Tony Gosling, wishing you a very good week. Thanks for listening. Till the same time next week. Goodbye for now.
Well, on a brighter note, commercial break.
The government has now banned the carrying of spears. Stop about every 1,000 miles ain't asking too much, is it? You might wish to stay on and listen.
It was a place where everything was legal.
I met this woman. So if you're looking for emotional satisfaction, my advice to you